Hashtag the wardrobe that built a king. Inside Michael Jackson's stage armor. Picture this. A single glove, covered in crystals, catches a stage light for maybe 2 seconds. That is all it takes. Millions of people who saw it once still remember exactly where they were. How does 2 seconds of fabric and rhinestone end up rewriting the history of live performance? Stay with me because by the end of this you will never look at a stage costume the same way again. Michael Jackson did not just get dressed for a show. He built a second body out of cloth, metal, and light, and that second body carried its own language. Every zipper, every shoulder pad, every hand-sewn bead was chosen the way a director chooses a camera angle. Nothing on that stage was an accident, and today we are going to take that idea apart piece by piece. Hashtag Chapter 1. The Glove That Stopped Time. Motown 25, 1983. Jackson steps out to perform Billie Jean, and on his right hand is a single white glove, hand-stitched with crystals from wrist to fingertip. Only one hand, not two. Think about that choice for a second. Why would a performer cover only one hand and leave the other bare? It seems almost unfinished, doesn't it? But that imbalance was the entire point. A symmetrical look, 2 matching gloves, would have simply looked elegant and then faded into the background. One glove created a visual accident that the eye could not ignore. Every time Jackson flicked his wrist or snapped his fingers, that single point of light dragged the audience's attention exactly where he wanted it, onto the choreography itself. Over the following years, his team built several versions of that glove, some dense with crystal for film close-ups, others lighter for the physical demands of a live tour. But the underlying idea never moved an inch. After Jackson's death, one surviving glove crossed the auction block for a 6-figure sum, an almost unthinkable price for what amounts to a swatch of fabric and glass beads. That number alone tells you how deep this single accessory had burrowed into the public imagination. It may still be the most valuable piece of stagewear in the history of popular music. Here's a question worth sitting with. Could an outfit that expensive and that iconic really have started as a rushed, last-minute decision? Or does something that powerful only happen when every detail has already been rehearsed 100 times in someone's head? Drop your theory in the comments because the answer might surprise you. Hashtag Chapter 2. A jacket sewn by his mother. Underneath that glove was a black jacket covered in sequins. And here is a detail that a lot of fans miss entirely. That jacket was not the work of some famous costume house. It was hand-sewn by Jackson's own mother, Catherine. The cut was short and simple, cropped high enough that his shoulders and arms had total freedom of movement. There was nothing heavy or restrictive about it, because restriction was the enemy. Jackson needed to glide across the stage, spin on a single foot, and freeze on a dime, and a bulky garment would have fought him at every turn. Under the television lights that night, the sequins caught every pivot, and by the time the performance ended, an entirely new stage persona had locked into place. That combination, the glove, the sequin jacket, the fedora, the loafers, became one of the most imitated costumes of the entire 20th century, copied in school talent shows and high-fashion runways alike. And it started at a sewing machine at home, not in a design studio. Isn't it strange how the most copied look in pop culture began as a mother sewing beads onto fabric for her son? Hashtag Chapter 3. Blood red leather and a werewolf's fur. Now let's talk about Thriller, because this is where things get genuinely strange in the best possible way. Costume designer Deborah Nadoolman Landis built the red leather jacket for the short film by blending 2 very different reference points, 1950s varsity style and the harder edge of punk fashion. The shoulders were winged outward to broaden Jackson's frame, and a sharp black V of trim ran down the front, pulling the eye downward and giving him a commanding, almost armored presence during the dance sequence. Only 2 of those jackets were ever produced for filming, which is exactly why a surviving original became so valuable. One sold at auction in 2011 for close to $2 million. An eye-watering number for a piece of clothing built for a 9-minute music video. That jacket eventually became something bigger than a costume. It turned into a Halloween staple, a fashion reference, a museum artifact, all at once. But before that jacket even appears on screen, Thriller opens with something else entirely. Special effects legend Rick Baker built a full werewolf transformation, prosthetics that reshaped Jackson's face completely, yellow contact lenses, a full suit of fur, clawed hands. Think about what that meant for a performer at the absolute peak of his fame. He agreed to bury the most recognizable face on the planet under layers of monster makeup, purely because the story demanded it. That is not vanity. That is trust in the material over the image, and very few artists at that level of stardom would ever take that risk. ## Chapter 4. The Suit That Defied Gravity. Fast forward to 1988 and the Moonwalker film, and you get a white suit, a pale blue shirt, and a white fedora, a look sharp enough to cut glass. The silhouette borrowed from old Hollywood gangster films, the kind of tailoring worn by characters who moved through smoke-filled rooms with total control. But Jackson's version felt entirely modern because of how clean and precise the lines were. That suit had to be reinforced from the inside to survive one specific move, the anti-gravity lean, where Jackson tips his entire body forward at an angle that should be physically impossible. The trick lived in his shoes, which were secretly built to lock into hidden posts on the stage floor. The suit had to accommodate all of that mechanical engineering without bunching, tearing, or giving the illusion away. And the fedora, tilted low over his eyes, completed a very simple message. Sometimes the sharpest weapon in a performer's arsenal is not the most decorated one. It's the cleanest one. Have you ever tried the lean yourself, even just leaning forward as far as you can without falling? It is genuinely much harder than it looks on screen. Let us know in the comments if you have ever attempted it. ## Chapter 5. Leather, Buckles, and Street Credibility. By 1987, working with director Martin Scorsese on the short film Bad, Jackson made a hard turn away from fantasy and toward something rougher. The all-black leather jacket, loaded with zippers and silver buckles, worn over a plain white t-shirt, read as tough and confrontational, a deliberate break from the softer, more theatrical costumes he had worn before. It matched the story being told on screen, where Jackson's character returns from private school to his old, rough neighborhood and has to prove he has not lost his edge. That leather jacket was everywhere by the late 80s, copied endlessly by fans and fashion labels. It proved something important. Jackson could completely shift his visual vocabulary to match a new era of music without losing his grip on culture. This was not about crowns or fantasy anymore. This was about credibility, and it landed exactly where it was supposed to. ## Chapter 6. A Living Statue in Gold. Jump ahead to 1995 and the History album campaign, and the costume choice becomes almost unsettling in its ambition. Jackson appears in a rigid, form-fitted gold bodysuit, sculpted so precisely to his frame that he looks less like a man and more like something cast in metal. Round, mirrored sunglasses hide his eyes completely, and the entire image radiates a cold, monumental kind of power. The promotional campaign paired this look with a massive statue of Jackson unveiled before a roaring crowd, deliberately blurring the line between the living performer and a historical monument. This was a costume built around the idea of legacy itself, the strange sensation of being treated as history while you are still alive to walk through it. No other pop artist of that era attempted anything quite that conceptually bold with a single image. That gold suit was never meant to move. It was meant to stand still forever, and in the photographs it still does exactly that. ## Chapter 6.5 Robes for a Living Legend. Before we get to the quieter, more political costumes, there is one look that deserves its own moment because it shows a completely different side of Jackson's visual imagination. In the 1992 video for Remember the Time, director John Singleton placed Jackson inside an ancient Egyptian palace, dressed in layered, gold-trimmed robes that looked pulled straight from a royal court. The cast around him included Eddie Murphy, Iman, and Magic Johnson, a deliberate gathering of black cultural icons at the height of their influence. Unlike the rigid, structured jackets we've talked about so far, these robes were built for flow. They shimmered with gold thread and were cut specifically to move dramatically during a sand-spinning dance sequence, one where Jackson glides across the floor as though friction simply does not apply to him. The costume blended African royal aesthetics with his own futuristic sensibility, presenting him less as a pop star and more as a mystical figure arriving to steal a royal court's attention. Where his military-inspired jackets projected power through stiffness and metal, these robes did the opposite, projecting power through liquid movement and drape. It's a reminder that his idea of authority on stage was never limited to one shape. Nearly a decade later, in the 2001 short film For You Rock My World, Jackson returned to a much darker, tailored jacket and fedora. Revisiting the gangster-inspired silhouette he first explored back in Smooth Criminal. This version sat shorter and closer to the body, with subtle detailing that played beautifully against the dim, warm lighting of the club setting in the video. It became his final major music video costume before his death, and watching it now, there is no sense that his instincts had dulled with time. If anything, it plays like a quiet victory lap, a mature evolution of a look that had defined one of his biggest visual triumphs over a decade earlier, delivered by a performer who had nothing left to prove but clearly still enjoyed proving it anyway. Chapter 7. Costume as protest. Not every outfit Jackson wore was about spectacle. Some of the most powerful choices in his career involved stripping everything away. For the 1996 video They Don't Care About Us, directed by Spike Lee, Jackson wore a plain, institutional prison uniform. No crystals, no gold plating, no fedora. That single wardrobe decision aligned his body visually with the incarcerated and the oppressed, forcing the audience to sit with the song's message about systemic injustice without a single distraction pulling their focus elsewhere. Around the same period, during a 1996 awards performance of Earth Song, Jackson wore a shirt that looked deliberately torn apart, as if the environmental destruction the song describes had physically ripped through the fabric. As the performance built toward its emotional peak, that fragile, shredded shirt became part of the storytelling itself, his exhaustion and rawness visible through the tears in the cloth. And in 1991, for Black or White, the wardrobe went even simpler. A plain white button-down shirt and black pants, worn loose and untucked. No royal embellishment anywhere in sight. The message of the song was racial unity, and the stripped-back look reinforced it by removing every trace of hierarchy from his silhouette. He was not separating himself from the crowd in that video. He was standing shoulder to shoulder inside it. Simplicity in that moment became its own kind of statement. Which of these do you think hit harder, the loud, maximalist costumes or the deliberately plain ones? It is worth thinking about before we move on. Chapter 8. Studying Kings to Become One. So where did all of this actually come from? According to longtime costume designer Michael Bush, who worked alongside Jackson and fellow designer Dennis Tompkins for roughly 25 years, Jackson was never chasing contemporary runway trends. He was drawn instead to European military history and the regalia of actual monarchs, wandering through museums, standing in front of glass cases holding centuries-old royal garments, and wanting immediately to translate that energy into something he could dance in. Bush has described how deeply Jackson admired historical military uniforms in particular, and how that admiration fed directly into his stage style. King Henry VIII's broad-shouldered, heavily ornamented silhouettes became a specific point of study, shaping the structure of Jackson's own jackets. Tompkins reportedly taught himself metalworking, soldering and sandblasting so he could build things like a sterling silver crown completely from scratch. Skills that simply do not exist in a standard fashion program. Bush is said to have summarized the entire philosophy in one memorable phrase: Liberace goes to war. It captured the fusion perfectly. Liberace's crystal-covered, flamboyant opulence merged with the rigid, commanding authority of a military uniform. Jackson reportedly told Bush that a uniform commands attention, and that broadened silhouette, cinched at the waist, was designed specifically to create a sense of mystique. Chapter 9. The Rules Nobody Broke. According to accounts from the design team, every garment had to satisfy four unspoken principles, ones you might call fit, function, delight, and originality. Fit meant the costume had to move like a second skin, flowing with the choreography instead of fighting it. Function was non-negotiable on a live stage, since no costume was allowed to risk a slip or a fall during a performance. Delight left room for whimsy, often borrowed from fairy tale imagery and childlike wonder. And originality may have been the strictest rule of all, because Bush and Tompkins were reportedly forbidden from repeating a previous design, no matter how beloved it had become with fans. That single rule explains why Jackson's wardrobe never sat still across 3 decades. Every tour and every video demanded something the audience had genuinely never seen before. There was also an unspoken rule about distance. If a fan in the front row could realistically afford to buy the exact same outfit, something had failed. The clothes had to be visibly, unmistakably out of reach, which is part of why so much of his stage wear involved gold plating, custom-molded armor, and hand-stitched embroidery that took hundreds of hours to complete. This was never about being relatable through fashion. It was about being aspirational, slightly unreal, almost untouchable. Even the shoes followed their own strict logic. Jackson reportedly refused to let anyone polish his loafers, because worn leather gave him grip, while a layer of polish introduced a real risk of slipping mid-performance. When special boots built for the Captain EO film failed him on set, the crew reportedly cut the soles out of a pair of sneakers so his trusted, broken-in loafers could be hidden inside that futuristic shell instead. Every choice, all the way down to the sole of a shoe, existed to protect the physical performance first. ## Chapter 10. What survived the man? Some of these costumes paid a brutal nightly price. The leather jackets worn during Beat It performances were reportedly torn off and thrown to the floor as part of the choreography every single night, and the zippers took the worst of the damage, bending and snapping under repeated stress. Bush has described spending late nights repairing that same hardware so the jacket would be stage-ready again by the next show. A cycle of destruction and restoration that stayed completely invisible to the crowd. Today, many of these pieces live on in museums and private collections, scattered across the world in glass cases, far outliving the man who once wore them into motion. And somewhere among them is a detail that never went to auction at all. A small embroidered figure sewn quietly into the lining of the jacket Jackson was buried in. A private piece of magic that was never meant for a stage or a bidding paddle. Just one last quiet gift from the hands that spent 25 years dressing a king. So here is the real question to leave you with. Was it the crystals, the gold, and the military tailoring that actually made these costumes iconic? Or was it the choreography and the man wearing them that made a single glove worth a fortune? Tell me your answer below, and if you have a favorite outfit from this list that we didn't dig deep enough into, let us know which one deserves its own full episode next.